And Professor Johanna Kantola is Professor of Gender Studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences at Tampere University, Finland. She obtained her PhD in politics at the University of Bristol in 2004 and became docent in politics at the University of Helsinki in 2007. She is the PI of the ERC Consolidated Grant Project, Gender, Party Politics and Democracy in Europe, EU, GenDem, and the director of the Academy of Finland funded research project, Gender and Power in Reconfigured Corporatist Finland. Her most recent books include Gender and Political Analysis with Emanuela Lombardo and Gender and the Economic Crisis in Europe, also with Emanuela. Gender and the European Union and the Oxford Handbook on Gender and Politics, which she co-edited with Georgina Whalen, Karen Salas and Laura Weldon. She is currently editor of Palgrave's Gender Politics book series with Sarah Childs. So it is a great privilege for us to have Professor Kantola speak to us today. And now we're going to cut to the pre-recorded lecture. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Johanna Kantola from Tampere University, Finland. And thank you very much for inviting me to give this keynote. And thank you, everyone, for joining me in listening to this keynote. It's really an honor to be talking to you about some of my recent research on gender, party politics and democracy in Europe, and specifically about studying European Parliament's political groups in turbulent times. And I start with a few words about the turbulent times. So the context of crisis that we can see now, or that we are in. So since 2008, we've had the economic crisis, which was intense at different moments of time in different parts of Europe, but which has been an ongoing crisis in many parts. From the point of view of gender, there's also been a rise in conservatism, conservative values across the continent, and on populism, which is obviously a very popular theme during this conference and these 3 days judging on the basis of the panel topics. From a gender point of view, this triangle of economic crisis and neoliberalism, conservatism and populism amounts to a certain masculinization of politics, dominance of masculine values and men as political actors. We've seen this in different countries. This context of crisis has been exacerbated, obviously, in Europe by Brexit, and now most recently by COVID-19. And all of these have detrimental gender impacts. And very closely linked to this has been the crisis in gender equality policies in the EU and in a number of member states. So in the context of the economic crisis, the failure of gender mainstreaming, of the austerity politics, of different responses to the economic crisis has been of central importance. But we've seen this downturn not just in gender mainstreaming, but in other parts of gender equality policy as well. So this is the crisis moment in many ways. But obviously, it's not only gloomy. So when there's an intense moment of crisis, we can also see the reactions against the crisis and maybe the new opportunities provided for different resistance movements and civil society actors. So also in relation to gender, gender equality, women's, feminist movements, there has been an activation of counter movements and politics and new policy openings in this context. So my questions for today, for this remaining about 20 minutes, is that what can feminist political analysis contribute to understanding the multiple crises that we are witnessing? And more specifically, how do they play out and with what effects for gender and democratic politics in a specific context of the European Parliament and its party politics. And this second research question, the more specific research question, is closely related to my current research project, funded by the European Research Council Consolidator Grant, and consisting of a team of 6 researchers at Tampere University, Finland, EU GenDem. And our aim is to provide a systematic gender analysis of European Parliament's party groups, their gendered practices and their policies. And I'm drawing on this research project and on this research today, presenting a very tiny part of its findings and drawing upon them. And you can find out more about what we are doing from our homepage and from our Twitter account. So in this project, we have this a twofold empirical research design. So on the one hand, we are looking at policies enacted in the European Parliament and in particular by the political groups. And the policy fields are economic, social and violence policies, and you can see them specified there. But we are not looking only at policies, we are looking at practices as well. So we are really interested in the formal and informal institutions, norms and practices of the Parliament's political groups. And in the current European Parliament, there are 7 political groups, from the EPP, European People's Party, the biggest conservative group, the Social Democrats, Renew, the Liberal group, Greens, the Left group, to the conservative right, the ECR, the ID, just to give you an idea. So we're doing a parliamentary ethnography in the European Parliament to look at these practices and informal institutions. And then we are looking at very specific questions relating to the conditions of internal democracy and internal functioning of these groups, such as how do they form, what are their leadership and decision-making practices, what are their gender equality practices, what is the impact of populism, Brexit, COVID on these groups. And it's maybe this final point about the impact of populism that I'm talking most about today. So a very small part of the bigger project. Why should we care about the European Parliament's political groups in these crisis times? From the point of view, when we think about gender and the European Union, its various institutions, European Parliament has been very important for gender equality policies. It has a strong reputation in gender equality. It's seen as the key actor, the one who always puts it on the agenda vis-a-vis the Commission or the Council, keeps it on the agenda and fights for it. So the question obviously is that when we dig deeper into the European Parliament, does it live up to this reputation, this strong reputation of gender equality, especially in turbulent times? And whether it lives up to it or not is obviously crucial for social justice, democracy, just representation, key questions of our times. So these are some of the broader justifications why I say to you that we should be looking at these political groups, at party politics, at the level of European Parliament. But it's also true that these political groups have been understudied with qualitative methods. So there's been a lot of interest in studying them with quantitative methods, looking at different voting patterns and group cohesion from that point of view. But we are taking a different route. Obviously, we are not the only people in Europe doing this research, but we are doing parliamentary ethnography, which is, we suggest, theoretically and methodologically interesting because it allows for this analysis of not just the formal institutions, what's written in the rules of procedure of the parliament or in the way that the political groups work formally, but what are the informal institutions, what are their practices and what are the struggles around this? So not just the voting patterns, but also internal democracy. And obviously the times of crisis that I mentioned in the first slide brings a very specific context to studying these issues. So it's very important to note that now we have a crisis time, but despite the good reputation, the European Parliament has not been gender equal, but rather there are persistent gender inequalities. And these have been studied, and I'm giving you some ideas here, and we have already added to these studies. So obviously there's the question of political representation of women and ethnic and racialized minorities in the European Parliament. Women's representation is around 40% now, an all-time record. So despite the crisis, we see this positive moment since the elections in 2019, an increase in the number of women in the European Parliament. However, we don't see a positive moment for ethnic and racialized minorities. The European Parliament is a very wide institution. So we can already see from a point of view of intersectionality, we can see serious problems there. We have been looking at the gendered political, policy and administrative leadership within the European Parliament and especially within the political groups. And of these policy leadership, the way that women can work in committees, be part of the working parliament, do their representative work in the parliament's committees. This is the most gender equal part. However, there remain gendered inequalities in political leadership, who is chairing the groups and who gives face to the groups, and administrative leadership. In addition, it's clear that political groups are gendered organizations. They mean different things for women and men politicians. And this can be seen in the gendered policymaking structures and especially expertise. So for example, expertise in economic policymaking is particularly gendered. So women politicians have a particularly difficult time in committees related to economic issues. And here, when we look at the groups, we see a very familiar division between left, green, social democratic groups, perhaps liberal groups, and then right conservative groups, which are more conservative in their gender composition and gender policies. And here, the biggest group of the parliament, EPP, is a particular problem. So even where many other groups perform well, for example, in policy leadership, in the number of women that they send to committees or who are so-called coordinators of political groups, in particular committees and policy areas. So the EPP lags behind. And we can also see that it does pose challenges if it is the biggest and the most powerful group in many ways. Although obviously the parliament is changing and other groups are important too. So, and there also, we are interested in the deviations to this norm when we look at the different policy fields and the very different practices. As importantly, a lot of discrimination persists. We've studied sexual harassment and especially the Me Too EP campaign, which targeted the European Parliament internally. And we've studied the manifestations of misogynist and racist language in the Parliament. So despite the good reputation, these are all there. Sexism prevails, the focus on women's looks and appearances, and I mentioned already challenging women politicians' expertise, especially in economic affairs and foreign and security policy, for example. And these are trends that are familiar to us from member state or national context as well. Gendered care and poor practices for combining a political career and care come to fore as well. And here the position of young women politicians in seemingly gender equal political contexts becomes relevant. And this is a finding from the very gender equal Swedish parliament as well, by Josefina Eriksson and Cecilia Josefsson, and also from our research in the European Parliament. So young women politicians have to fight these gendered stereotypes, appear tough and fearless, and many of these sexist practices and discrimination target them in particular. So if we move on more to the crisis context, we have these gendered inequalities in the European Parliament, and then we have, for example, the impact of radical right populism arriving on top of it. So together with Emanuela Lombardo, I've studied in a recent piece, which is just coming out in the International Political Science Review, a special issue that me and Emanuela Lombardo are editing on populism and feminist politics. So we have studied the opposition strategies of right populists against gender equality in the European Parliament. So what is the impact of radical right populism on advancing gender equality in the plenaries? And we've looked at all plenary debates of the last parliament, 2014 to 2019. There were about 94 debates. And we identified 34 debates which were particularly important to populists. And the topics were wide-ranging, obviously, from anything about education to very kind of gender-specific topics, quotas, action plans, and things like this. And one of our key findings is that for a long time, gender and EU scholars, such as myself, we tended to think that gender equality was very legitimate in the EU. And there was only indirect opposition to gender equality. There was kind of institutional resistance, and actors didn't push for it as much as they should. But now when we look at these debates and the impact of radical right populism, we see direct opposition strategies and their importance in the parliament. So we identified two direct opposition strategies. The first was an outright rejection of gender equality in relation to specific topics, such as gender quotas or LHBTI rights. And also, when I mentioned discrimination earlier and its existence in the parliament, so also using very misogynist speech in the plenary debates. So this is one part that's now come to the fore. A second part of these direct opposition strategies is constructing gender equality as gender ideology. So the familiar radical right populist construction of gender ideology. Any attempts to advance gender equality are constructed as nonsense. In the European Parliament, they're called minority problems, they're called waste of time. The European Union is painted as an elitist project, which is trying to advance, push for this gender ideology in member states. So this is a very big debate. Obviously, the indirect opposition strategies are still there. They have not gone anywhere. And we identified, when looking at these debates, plenary debates, we identified four. So Euroscepticism and subsidiarity, using these to claim that gender equality is not a matter for the EU, it's a matter of member states. So this is a very strong indirect opposition strategy. Gender equality questions are also banned for other topics. So for example, for opposing Islam and immigration, used for other means. For example, talking about violence against, in inverted commas, our women by these others. So the bending is an important indirect opposition strategy. Self-victimization, constructing men and boys as the real victims. So for example, this could be seen in the debates on sexual harassment and Me Too EP. So men and boys are the victims of all this talk about sexual harassment. Innocent men are seen as perpetrators. Kate Mann, the famous philosopher from the US, uses the term himpathy to describe this. And also part of the self-victimization is blaming those who want to advance gender equality for double standards. These are very familiar strategies, also from the national level, from the studies of radical right populists. And finally, we identify this depoliticization. So obviously seeing gender, sex as biological and binary, taking the political, the constructed nature away from it, calling, for example, and this is now in inverted commas, so not my language, intersex rights, fake rights, for example, and using science selectively for own means. So these are some of the indirect opposition strategies. And we might ask that, what are the effects of this? Like, does it matter when there's all this talk and opposition to gender equality in the European Parliament? So obviously, the policy impact is limited, and many scholars, such as Natalie Brack, Ariadna Ripple-Servant, have shown that the radical right populists in the European Parliament, they're more interested in this performative function and not engaging in policy making. Nevertheless, this does create a hostile, affective atmosphere towards gender equality and LGBTQI issues and rights in the European Parliament. And old arguments against gender equality are packaged in this new populist parcel. And I mentioned here the specific challenges that this matters, because this does create challenges for frameworks such as the gender-sensitive parliaments frameworks, where parliaments there's an attempt to make parliaments more gender-sensitive and gender equal. And also, I wanted to very briefly, I only have some 4 minutes left of your time, so talk to you a bit about our other paper, where we then try to look at the practices of the political groups. So in this paper that I have just kind of briefly described to you, we looked at the rhetorical level and the discursive opposition to gender equality. But what's going on in terms of the political group practices, which was an important part of our EU Gendem project. And here we can look at democracy, de-democratization, and political groups practices. And the EU has been critiqued for attempting to be this democratic actor, yet for its authoritarian equilibrium, for failing to stand up against regimes such as the one in Hungary and in Poland, which are going against the rule of the law. And the EP has reacted against this democratic backsliding in the member states, perhaps better than some of the other EU institutions. But problems have been identified within the European Parliament's own structures. And one such problem is this idea that the political groups need to be big in order to have influence in the Parliament. So this partially explains why the EPP has not managed maybe to get rid of Orbán's Fidesz from within its structures. And we argue that these have not been systematically studied from the point of view of political groups or a gender perspective. And we are using this extensive interview material that we have gathered with my colleagues in EU Gendem, but also again, the plenary debates that I mentioned to study these issues. And we really see this when we look at the democratic back practices of the political groups. How do the political groups then function democratically? So we see in our analysis this gap between formal and informal practices of democracy. And interestingly, for example, both on the Greens, kind of whom would assume to be democratic and gender equal side of the political spectrum, but also the radical right populist groups, both perceive their practices as formally democratic, transparent and open, and obviously for different reasons. So in the Greens, there is this respect for different views, and gender equality is a norm and an actual outcome. And then we have these great internal contradictions in citations about democracy and the way that it is enacted among the radical right populist groups that we describe in the paper. So we have all these discursive references to the importance of democracy, but not living up to it in actual practices. And I mentioned there that the other groups are willing to recognize a lack of democratic practices, power hierarchies, lack of transparency, debates and votes, and maybe to look for ways to make this better, to make the political groups function democratically in difficult times. And I have 30 seconds left. So I think I'll go directly to my conclusions and skip some of these findings of this paper and use these last seconds to say a few words about what can feminist political analysis then contribute to understanding the multiple crises. This was my first question. So I think if I want you to take something with you from this presentation is the idea that gender is an integral part of this crisis, and feminist political analysis can illuminate this. It's not a minor thing to be studied in relation to some parts of this crisis, but it's really there, and it's illustrated by the attacks on gender equality by the radical right populists. And there really, it is really democracy and, for example, European integration, which is at stake. So sidelining gender equality policies, sidelining gender equality work, such as gender mainstreaming of economic recovery and austerity politics, which are important during the COVID-19 crisis too, exacerbates gendered inequalities. And this is another reason for why gender must be taken into account as an integral part to responses to the crisis. So thank you very much for listening to me. And I'm very happy to reply to some of your questions, and sorry for having to skip the 2 slides in the end, but I hope the broader arguments were understandable to you. Thank you.
We're asking people to use the question and answer function. If they have any questions to pose to Johanna this morning, I have some remarks and some questions that I can start us off with. I first would like to once again thank you very much for agreeing to do this under such unusual circumstances, Johanna. And I have really enjoyed the recorded presentation that I had the privilege of receiving a few days ago, so I could watch it at my leisure and stop and pause and think and go back. And we have recorded the session this morning, and it's being live streamed on Facebook as well, so we know there are people watching it in those venues also. But it offered me, I would say, the most comprehensive account of your project so far. So I've been following it with great interest over the past year or so, and the particular outputs. But you have this beautiful narrative structure, I think, that really pulls all the different methodological and theoretical contributions, and then centers it so firmly, I think, in this contemporary moment, particularly of these multiple intersecting connective crises. And in listening to the work, you know, as we were in a sociology space, it really reminded me of your deep roots, I suppose, within social science and within sociology more firmly. And I think your effort, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, really to steer this interdisciplinary path between a political scientific approach to parliaments, to women in politics, and then to place it in a broader, I would say, theoretical and kind of epistemological, maybe even ontological perspective that really centers sociology and social action, human agency, the ethnographic approach to the Parliament, particularly this aim to get the thick description, to make visible all of the micropolitics at play and how they're deeply gendered and raced and classed in the everyday practice of politics, which is so important, particularly when we want to reveal inequality and its persistence. And in listening to the presentation, I was also reminded of some kind of old work that's a little bit traditional and binary in its formulation, but comes from Cynthia Fuchs Epstein in the US, and her assumptions really about how gender is used as a boundary marker. You know, it's a very simple argument essentially in many ways, but this notion that in conceptual, physical, social, and cognitive ways, gender is used to make these boundaries. And her work essentially also offers this effort to remind us of the vast resources that are intentionally employed over time and over space to maintain those boundaries. And I was very much minded of that, particularly as you made that remark, which we've all been, I think, privy to, which is this idea that we assume the EU is a good actor for gender equality and that the Parliament is always this gender-friendly space. I know myself, when I did a tiny bit of work that compared the Irish context in terms of parliamentary politics to the EU, I did work from that assumption initially, that this was a safe place, this was a good place for women, relative to the domestic arena. And I think this very sociological approach that you've adopted has really revealed in a very nuanced way how we can't be complacent about that. And of course, it also offers something really important to us. There's a lot of noise, isn't there, around populism and the threat to democracy. And the project itself, I think, is very well situated to offer this empirical base, to really get at the roots of what that means for political practice and the quality of democracy and how it's enacted in the everyday. And so things that we've known for a long time in feminist theory and in mainstream sociology about silencing, about making people smaller in space based on their social status, how does that work in this formal institutional context? So there are just some remarks I had. I do have a couple of questions. I'd a little bit hear your response to me accusing you of being really just a sociologist like the rest of us. But also, I know that you talked a little, and I know you had to skip because you were incredibly disciplined with your time. But you talked a little bit about how when you, particularly with a piece of research that looks at the parties themselves, and you know, there is the truism that left-leaning Green parties are generally safer places or havens for women, and we generally expect different standards and different practices there in terms of democracy, and that fits with your work. And then we would have different set of expectations around centre-right or more conservative and obviously radical right configurations. You did mention deviations and exceptions to that. And I'm really fascinated to hear a little bit more about that. So perhaps if we start with that and we can see if we have some questions there.
Thank you so much, Pauline. And thanks again for the kind invitation to give me the space to talk about our research. Yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on the technical problems, but obviously it's very funny that I rushed to the end part twice. So I was laughing. I had to keep the volume down because I couldn't listen to myself. And then I would have been forced to listen to myself. So it was very amusing. But thank you so much for this very kind of a kind reading of our research project, EU Gender, and of this kind of particular talk. I'm very happy to be framed as a sociologist or a political sociologist. I think the way that you described kind of the significance of this research, the democratic practices being embedded in the broader institutional context, the work that gender does there, this kind of boundary work and all of these things, it was really kind of a nice take on it all. And I think I'm a political scientist by training, and I think we have more kind of difficulties trying to communicate this approach and these findings to the kind of traditional political science audience or EU studies people, maybe because of the reason that you mentioned, that it is quite interdisciplinary, and we have this kind of parliamentary ethnographic approach, thick description. So it was nice to hear that you kind of got the point that we were trying to communicate in a sense. And I think it encourages us all in our attempts to communicate these findings. So thank you for that. And so a few words about the kind of the specific question that you had, which was about the deviations. So obviously, I very quickly kind of skipped over the interview data that we have. So it's already quite substantial, as we have 123 interviews, soon about 130, and the number is increasing now as we've continued remotely doing the interviews. So it's a lot as such, and it's very kind of double-edged, because on the one hand, we are really able to see that some of these old lines of division that you mentioned yourself, this kind of, and that was in the presentation, this left, green, liberal, being very kind of benign towards gender equality, and then the challenges that we have on the conservative right side of the political spectrum, and then especially the radical right populists. So this is all there in terms of the bigger picture, but obviously when we dig into these things, so we do see that there is resistance within the Social Democrats, for example, because it is so, the political groups, some of them are quite big and they are very diverse. So you do get MEPs from very different kind of national contexts, and the national context does come into play. So, you know, in the Social Democrats, there are those who oppose, and it is a struggle for the group line in terms of this. And similarly, some of the radical right populist groups, they may perform quite well in terms of descriptive representation of women, numbers of women, and how they sometimes send women to important positions. And when we look at not just kind of gender, but let's say more kind of intersectional questions, race and ethnicity. So for example, the ECR, which is where the UK Conservatives were, but which has now become more kind of radical right populists with Brexit, dominated by the Polish Law and Justice Party. So we see a very interesting kind of putting kind of Black and ethnic minority people into important positions as well. And then understanding how this is a contradiction for a group which is termed radical right populists. So this is maybe kind of the double-edged side, aiming to say something general, but then also taking the nuances that come out of this quite expansive research data. We have the interviews, then obviously we have the parliamentary ethnography, which I didn't use here, which has been conducted by Jerry Miller, who will be kind of working on papers on that. But then we're also looking at plenary debates and committee reports and various data sets. Yeah.
Great. So in many ways, you know, I suppose one of the strengths of the project in particular is this multi-method approach. And it is, you know, what we'd probably call the sociology of everyday life, isn't it? It's how people get up in the morning and try to navigate not only the formal institutional context, but also the informal practices and expectations. And I know you're particularly interested in younger MEPs and their efforts, particularly female MEPs, and their efforts to figure it all out. And I'm just wondering, are there any particular kind of insights there, generational insights, or an indication of some kinds of shifts, you know, between generations in terms of their understanding or their resistance to older practices? But also, one thing that always fascinates me is You know, where do they get socialized? You know, we've talked a little bit, and I know the literature does talk a bit about, you know, the European Parliament's political socialization function for MEPs. You know, particularly the difference between how they, if they've had a previous political career in the national context, how things are done differently there. And this wonderful typology you have about the different forms of the way in which gender equality is resisted indicates that definitely right-wing groups learn from each other, don't they? And they have the playbook is there, and they're obviously socializing each other in the space to use it in this way. But I'm just wondering about perhaps if you see a generational shift, or if we can indicate where that political socialization might happen.
Yeah, it's a very nice question. We haven't kind of directly looked at it, so I can't provide you a very kind of precise answer. And it's more that we've kind of like one of the findings is this finding that especially kind of the younger women MEPs have a hard time because of the gender practices and the gendered inequalities that I described there. They kind of come together in the category of the young woman politician. And this is obviously a finding that Josefina Eriksson and Cecilia Josefsson have had in the in the Swedish parliament. But we are also seeing this kind of what you mentioned about the right wing or the radical right populist groups, this kind of learning process. And like some of our, we haven't written this anywhere, but some of our interview data shows that like some of the radical right populist MEPs, they adopt a harsher rhetoric in the European Parliament than in the national context. So it's a very kind of a specific form of socialization that you have this gender ideology, rejection of gender equality. It's legitimate now in the European Parliament, and it might not be in national context. If we think about the Nordic countries, for example, you have to be a bit more careful, but you get socialized into these rhetorics that I described there on that side of the political spectrum. So absolutely. And I think these are the kinds of questions that I'm really glad that you raised it, because obviously we have a lot of research material, so we can kind of look at it from a lot of different points of view. So it's good to get these questions, you know, what we are not doing and what we could be doing.
Typical. These are the questions I never want anyone to ask me, of course, you know, the ones that I'm speculating about rather than, but they are fascinating. We do have a question. We have kind of a comment in the question in the question and answers that I'm going to read. And it states, I see how gender is central to the crisis, and in a sense that anti-feminism is a discursive resource for the right-wing populist bloc. Also the association between feminism and the EU, which seems to provide them with a double rhetorical resource. Having said that, are there ways that feminism or general gender egalitarianism can act as a resource for the general movement against right-wing populism? This could be discursively, or in terms of voting blocks and support, or in terms of political organisation, civil society. Is that ever the case? Or does the mobilisation of gender and politics always work in favour of right-wing populism? And that is from Professor Sean O'Rian here of the Sociology Department at Maynooth University. Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, thanks. I'll take that one first. I think it's a really, really important point. And I've realised kind of like when I present these ideas about how gender equality is used by radical right populists. So kind of the side of the democratizing side often gets lost. The resistance and the counter strategy radical right populism that gender also allows for. And I think like part of this crisis and what I've been interested in, especially in the Finnish context, is how they really do activate this, kind of activate feminist resistance at the level of political parties, in the civil society, in parliaments. So I think we've seen it in Finland. And now I mentioned Emanuela Lombardo there many times, so I'm obviously working with her. And we have just decided that this is what our next paper should be, exactly this question, kind of not looking at the depressing side, so to say, but really how you can mobilize around gender to resist. Because this absolutely happens in the European Parliament as well. And it's also kind of a, this was now this paper, but in the project and me personally, I think it's really important to focus on the normal institutional work for gender equality, and all the practices and all the actors that are working for gender equality. And actually, we've seen 2019 was quite a positive moment for gender equality in that sense in the EU, that there was the Ursula von der Leyen Commission, the first gender balance commission, the first ever commissioner for gender equality, Helena Dalli. So there was a lot of kind of positiveness in the air. And we know that the EPP, for example, which are termed here fairly conservative and still fairly problematic from the point of view of gender, it was important to them. They were proud that it was some of these things came from their side of the political spectrum. So obviously now 2020, COVID-19, we don't know what's going to happen and whether gender is going to slip from the political agenda again. But what is implied by this question, I absolutely agree, and I think it's really, really important.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Professor Carlo Rusa from Trento. What do you think are the chances of unifying liberal and leftist groups in a coalition that opposes radical right populists in a structured and ideationally cohesive way beyond the cordon sanitaire? Is the need of an anti-populist frame discussed in your interviews? So it's a little bit related. But
yeah, it's a little bit related, but relates more to maybe to the research data. So we've written in kind of papers that I didn't mention here, we've written quite a bit about the cordon sanitaire, and which kind of closes off the radical right populist groups from the decision-making procedures in the European Parliament. So they are not given committee chair positions and other kind of important positions. So we've written a bit how it's kind of it's also a constructed norm, and people interpret it very differently. So this is what we can see from the interviews, that there is this informal institution of cordon sanitaire, which is supposed to be, which is a very important part of the anti-populist strategy of this kind of liberal, left, green, but also EPP groups in the European Parliament. But people interpret it differently. But I think we've been a bit disappointed with some of the work that we don't see these very clear strategies for anti-populism that is mentioned in Carlo Ruzza's comment. And what we see in the interviews is that a lot of these strategies are very individual. So it's individual women MEPs who describe their individual strategies against the radical right populists in the European Parliament. And now I'm going to our ethnographic data, and we've attended the political group meetings. So in these political group meetings, for example, the Social Democrats group meetings, these strategies against populism, they are discussed, but we haven't really spotted how they would materialize, except on this individual level, that whether you accept, for example, these blue cards in a plenary debate, whether you take comments from the radical right populists, or whether you oppose it in an individual way. We have a lot of kind of, especially women MEPs, who are calling for this more systematic approach, but we haven't yet kind of spotted it, how it would materialize. So this would be my reply to this question.
I think that's very interesting, because I'm on the edges of efforts to try and map an emerging kind of right-wing populist, I wouldn't say it's a movement, but I suppose different actors and different small constellations in Ireland. And part of the kind of training, I suppose, or consciousness raising that we were given as kind of civil society or academics was, this warning about the amplification. Once you engage with right-wing populist rhetoric discursively, the danger of amplification of their message. And the importance of being very careful that you curate your discursive response in particular ways. But but also, the value of not responding. The value of simply just not responding sometimes, and it speaks to one of your findings, which is fascinating, and that is that it is a performance. That sometimes there seems to be two things going on. So obviously, there is an effort to say that gender doesn't matter; it shouldn't be discussed here. It's settled, and that's a particular version of a right-wing populist frame. And the other one is, well, you're pushing too far, or we need to pull back into a more traditional mode. So either it doesn't matter and it's settled, or the different variants of it. But in those particular formulations, gender is being used to do all this ideational heavy work, isn't it? It's being used to do all this political work all the time. And it's useful for us because we can figure out who's who by their position on gender. So we can use it ourselves to understand where the boundaries are. But then how does one then obviously respond in a particular way that is obviously normatively in line with the values of your group, but also that doesn't amplify the message, particularly if there is a sense that it is simply a performance. It's about creating noise in that way. So I don't know, and I know that's a question posed to individuals but on social media and other spaces, but in terms of political strategy, it's probably an important one also.
Yes, I would absolutely agree. And we have a lot of, obviously we've interviewed the radical right populist groups and MEPs as well. Yes. So they speak a lot very openly about this, what you described as the amplification strategy. So they're quite open about it, that they can make the plenary speeches and then the message is amplified in the social media. And it's the kind of a key way of doing their politics in the European Parliament, which is not about kind of engaging in the policy making processes or the committee work or kind of this normal stuff. And then the other part of your question, which is still about this kind of strategies, that political groups or political parties or MEPs or civil society could adopt. So I think it's such a difficult question. And I also kind of often get asked in the Finnish context to come and talk about these things, but rather from this strategy point of view, like what can you do? And I must say that I'm still not there to be able to tell, for example, women politicians that how should you react? But obviously there are a lot of good practices. I think this is, if we take it back to the context of the European Parliament or any parliament or any political group. So it's really about the dealing with these issues on this structural level or institutional level, and really providing the support structures for individual MEPs and moving away from this. This is my way of dealing with it. I make the decision whether I engage with it in the social media or not. So really kind of providing the adequate support. And I think it's interesting, obviously it's a question for us in the universities as well. I don't know how it is for the rest of the people who listen to this, but at least I get hate emails and comments in the social media. And I can say that my university doesn't have an effective strategy to support researchers on this. So it's a very similar question, like how to take it to the institutional level in the parliamentary politics, and then also for a lot of other people working on these topics.
And I think, this is a bit controversial to say maybe, but there's also a bit of political capital to be gained for being seen to stand up against the far right in a strategic way in the Parliament if you're a centrist. But you need to do it in the context of Brexit or in a very particular context, rather than. So what I'm really saying is that in the centre and maybe on the left also for left-wing populists, there's also a performance, isn't there, around opposition that can sound really good in the plenary or whatever, but actually then the other work is not being done to resist you know, ideas or practices. So I suppose we have to see it from both sides, obviously not symmetrically, but the notion of politics as performance. And I guess we have to go back to our feminist political scientists and people like Sharon Ray and others and say, you know, that early ethnographic work again that looks at politics as performance and as ritual has been so instructive in helping us to figure out that how weird parliaments are really as spaces where the rules of everyday life are suspended, and then these strange rituals come into play that can offer these efforts to do this impression management, to do this kind of display of concern, rhetorical display, and then maybe so perhaps in this when you know, I did that tiny bit of work on the women's lobbies efforts to try and connect European integration with gender equality, and maybe because we are just close to finishing out our time now. Maybe the last thing you could comment on is, you know, you have these broader, really powerful, I would say, findings that speak to the nature and quality of European democracy. And you are making a claim that without the defense of gender equality, you can't defend liberal democracy. Maybe you could just speak a little bit to that and your perspective on that.
Yeah, it's basically, as you said, that it's the kind of the intimate connection between gender equality and democracy that we are trying to spell out, and also kind of really using the feminist theories of democracy, because there seems to be this gap that we have this emerging really strong empirical research in gender and politics about de-democratization in Europe. And then we have really good feminist theories about democracy, but maybe they are not brought together all the time. So I think as part of this effort that you described, trying to show how central gender is, we wish to bring these debates together, kind of the theoretical feminist debates on gender, that some of them were mentioned on the slides, but I didn't have time to go into it. And then this kind of very empirical research, how we are backsliding on democracy and what work gender does there.
Yeah, and it's a powerful research agenda. I've noticed now that I'm not being a good timekeeper because we're just out of time, but I really want to thank you again. It's been absolutely so informative and inspiring, and we wish you all the best of luck with the ERC project, and we'll be watching and learning as we go along. And I invite you obviously to attend our other panels, and thank our attendees very much for the questions and for the interest. And we're going to leave it there. So thank you very much, Professor Johanna Kantola, and goodbye everybody. You have to pop out of this link and go into a different link, and we're going to cross our fingers and hope for the best. You're going to end up in the right space. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pauline.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Bye.
Bye-bye.